So today we come to the end of the book of Genesis, Genesis 50, the book of beginnings. In Genesis, we've read about the beginning of time, the beginning of life, the beginning of marriage, the beginning of sin, the beginning of murder. We've seen the beginning of God's plan to redeem us. We've seen God's beginning of his nation through whom he would reveal himself. We've even seen the first prophecy of the Messiah to come. So as Genesis ends in Genesis chapter 50, it's kind of interesting that we read the end of the life of Joseph, clearly one of the most godly people in the entire book. But as Genesis 50 ends, Joseph makes an interesting request. He says, when our people leave Egypt and return to the land that God promised our forefather Abraham, make sure you take with me my bones. Don't leave my bones here in Egypt. It's kind of interesting because when you read the New Testament in the book of Hebrews chapter 11, you have a listing of the great people of faith. And Joseph makes the list. And of all the things, the great acts of Joseph, acts of faith, it's kind of interesting. Joseph is not praised for his act of faith and being faithful to God in slavery and in prison, being faithful to God as the second most powerful person in the world, being faithful to God even in the forgiveness of his brothers. When Joseph gets praised in the book of in Hebrews for his great act of faith, it's this act, his final act, requesting his bones be taken to the promised land. Isn't that great? In other words, Joseph's greatest act of faith was his last act of faith. Joseph ends his life that way, and so ends the book of Genesis. And so may it be that our faith is always increasing as well. May our most fruitful days always be the next.